Welcome to the FMCG guys. Hi, Efrain. How are you doing?
Good, Daniel. How are you?
Very good as well. Guess what's around the corner? What is the big event or the big events coming up in our industry?
Well, yes, I'm guessing if you're asking me during one of our podcast sessions, then it probably has to do with shopping.
That's correct. So what do we have coming up?
So, well, I think two big events come to mind. I guess three if we extend a little bit further. So we got Prime Day coming up, courtesy of our friends at Amazon. We've got Singles Day, the biggest single shopping day of the year. And then, of course, we've got holidays after that as well.
Yeah, and you're forgetting Black Friday.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Which, interestingly enough, has taken hold in a lot of the European countries as well, even though by nature of how it first started is actually quite interesting because it doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of the naming itself.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, actually, come to think about it, in Europe, in the world as well, but especially in Europe, it was all about Christmas until very recently. And all these other pre-Christmas occasions have come up in the last, 5 years maximum, I think?
Absolutely. And what's fascinating to me as an American living abroad is when you actually see it called by its actual English name, when you actually see it promoted in places like France or in Germany as Black Friday, right? Yeah. So it's actually, it in and of itself is a known entity. It's a brand. Yeah. So it's something that people actually know and they want to participate in. So it's really interesting to observe. And like you said, it's actually become quite a big event on the retail calendar for a lot of brands and retailers here in Europe.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it also affects, I think, both some parts of FMCG and retail. So yeah, Efrain and I thought that it would be very interesting to have an expert in the peak season. That's why we invited an old friend of mine, all the way from Miami. It's Nabil Malouli. He's heading up e-commerce at one of the main logistics companies, DHL. And we've invited him to better understand how companies in consumer goods and retail are preparing operationally and also commercially for the peak season. Hello, Nabil. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you, Daniel. Great to be here.
Hi, Nabil. Thanks for joining. Great to connect and excited to hear excited to have our discussion today, and I'm sure our audiences as well.
Absolutely. Great to see you, friend.
Nabil, as a matter of introduction for our audience, but also for ourselves, can you tell us a bit about what you're currently doing at DHL?
Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. So I'm the Senior Vice President of eCommerce Global. So I basically lead the fulfillment and last mile delivery strategy for the DHL supply chain business. My job, in a simple way, is to work and build solutions that will allow you as a consumer to get your products cheaper, faster, and at a better quality in terms of logistic and more sustainable way of transport. So that's what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can go pretty much straight into it. I mean, with the peak season of e-commerce coming, we decided, Nabil, to record this podcast in August because I know that you'll be very busy in the next few months. What are you expecting in CPG online sales and in retail online sales in the next few months in the peak season?
Yeah, so we are expecting to see a long peak season, an extended peak season. You know, we traditionally have seen in the past last 5 years, brands and retailers expanding, and moving away from that, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, crunching all the promotion into like 2 to 4 weeks period, into really expanding that across like 2 months, in some cases even 2 months and a half, in order to, first of all, to be able to execute on the peak in an easier manner, right? For example, to make sure that you can reach your service levels. And also, many companies are trying to get the customer attention earlier into the process, of course, and not only the attention, but the money, obviously, as well, in the meantime. So we expect this to continue this year. We expect the peak to start very early. We expect to have a lot of people actually waiting for promotional period in order to buy products. So we see a lot of inbound volume coming in, meaning that companies are preparing for a strong peak, and independent of some of the concerns that are out there on inflation, the entire economic situation, we still see that the volumes have, they've dropped a bit compared to maybe to last year's growth that we've seen, obviously in terms of percentages, but they still remain strong. And we think many people will be waiting for, discounts and promotional period to buy and to take advantage of that opportunity. And so I think we will see a strong peak. Online, and I think we'll see also a strong peak offline as well.
Mm-hmm. Does the fact that that consumers are going to wait for promotional items, does that have an implication on like the calendar? What difference does it make there? Because I imagine that's related to the whole inflation, potential recession, etc.
Yeah, so of course, when you're in a market like the one of today, with all the noise about potential recession, are we in recession, yes or no, and so on, what you found is that people are way more sensible in terms of spending. I think the other thing is, if you look at the entire, for example, in the US where I'm based, unemployment rate is still at the lowest level. And so people are working, people are making money. So we are in a very different situation than if you would compare, for example, to 2008. Yes, there have been a couple of layoffs in some, particularly in big tech and so on. But if you look at the amount of impact across all the workforce, it's a minor impact in terms of amount of people impacted. So people are more sensible to their spending habits, and I think that's why we're going to see, people waiting for that. And does it change, fundamentally, the planning and so on? Not at all, right? I mean, it's usually the planning for peak is oftentimes people think, oh, it's coming now, but it's planning for peak is similar to a boxing fight, right? It's all about the preparation, not so much about the moment where you're fighting. And so this is a year-round process where you have to work from January, up to the time actually the peak is really happening, to prepare, to train, to automate what you can automate. And that entire preparation is what makes it successful to actually execute during the tough days and the times where you have volumes that could go 5x, 10x, 20x the average volume that you get during the rest of the year.
Yeah. So Nabil, it's interesting that I love the analogy, by the way, of preparing for a boxing match. To that point, you've been in this business for quite some time, and you've seen, like you said, companies that this isn't their first rodeo, if you will, when in regards to preparing for peak season. What are some of the more successful brands and retailers doing in regards to that preparation before peak season? And what are in essence, what are some of those specific to-dos, if you will, around that? And how has that evolved over the last 5 years or so?
Yeah, so a combination of factors. What best-in-class companies do? Number one, you have to prepare the workforce. And preparing the workforce is a combination of factors. There is the obvious training, having processes that allow you to bring on people quickly through technology, recruiting, scanning candidates, training candidates so that they have the ability to come into the labor force very quickly and effectively is a key aspect. Another thing that is critical is you have to stretch yourself before the peak in order to be able to really see if you're going to be able to deliver. So, for example, in order to not impact service levels of customers, what we'll do is we will stretch windows of time during the same day where we will, for example, batch orders in order to simulate what would happen into a peak time, right? Where instead of releasing waves, what we call releasing wave, which is basically releasing orders for the pick and pack process, you just hold to them through the day for some hours, and then suddenly you will release like 10,000 orders, as an example, into a large warehouse to see the ability of the team, the processes, So you put yourself basically and you project yourself and your teams into that real experience. Another element that we found helps a lot is to be very flexible around the way you employ and you work during this period. So in many warehouses, we're talking about like a 24/7. It could be six days per week, 3 shifts, 24 hours. And so the ability to attract talent and resources to work during this time is obviously much harder because there is a lot of demand. And so how do you do to make shifts that are non-traditional and non-conventional shifts? You have people, they only want to work on Saturday morning, 4 hours. You have people, they only want to work on Monday night between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m., right? And this is not obvious, but there are these shift options actually allow you to also do things different and hire and bring on people that maybe would not have necessarily applied if they had to work 5 days per week, as an example. And I think another key point is adopting technologies that can scale. So that has been particularly something that we've seen really increasing in importance in the last 5 years. We use a lot of autonomous mobile robots as an example. So what we call picking assistants, we work with a company called Locus as an example, which is one of our key partners in this space. We are probably the largest user of picking assistants across the industry. And so this type of solutions allow you to scale up and down volume and throughput into a warehouse without having to add infrastructure, without having to add very, very important investments. So you can add bots during like 3 months or 4 months, as an example, in order to increase your total capacity, but without having to do any retrofitting or any major investment. And so, that's one. Robotic arms, the use of technologies that can scale without having to invest millions of dollars is also something that we see is critical right now.
Mm-hmm. And within this transformation, from DHL's point of view, working with all your partners in the industry, how are you helping optimize their supply chain for that? I mean, also from an organizational level.
So we have very different model of working. We have customers that have the expectation of having a turnkey solution, where basically they will hand over the entire operation, going from real estate, technology, operational execution, transport, and where we will bundle everything for them and we will execute on their behalf all the contracts. We will even build warehouses for some of our clients and so on. And you have others that will have maybe their own real estate, or they want to use some of their technology stack, or they want to use some of their processes. And so our model is built into modules where you can actually adapt depending on what the clients want. Particularly, for example, in CPG, you find a very large organization oftentimes have part of the ecosystem which is in-source. They will want to do certain things their own way, and they will ask you to bring value on the areas where they don't have maybe the same level of knowledge that you do, for example, robotics, automation, operational execution, but they might come and tell you, I want this building to run this way. And so they might be a bit more prescriptive on the way they want that business to be operated. So the way we look at this is, look, we are going to adapt and we're going to look at where we can bring the highest amount of value, and we will work with you basically in order to fill these gaps.
So to that point, Nabil, those best-in-class brands and retailers, it sounds like obviously flexibility or adaptability is critical. What are some of the must-dos for those companies in terms of like being able to, again, work effectively with the DHLs of the world, preparing for peak season?
I think there's two things. One is the use of technology for planning and for communication. Planning, forecasting is one of the hardest, if not the hardest part of the peak planning. And nobody really has built, a level of sophistication where they have, and they could tell you, we are very, very accurate and we know, because there's so many variables that are implied into an e-commerce business. So many. I mean, if you're a cosmetic company or if you're a fashion apparel company, you could have, one of your ambassador or someone famous that suddenly goes viral on a post wearing a T-shirt or putting a cream, and suddenly you'll have 15,000 order that drop in an hour. And so how can you plan this, right? I mean, it's impossible to plan. They could be a product that is just through the discount get really, really appealing. There are products that they know they're going to sell and they're going to sell really well. But I think one of the element that really helps is that communication and really that transparency around, hey, these are the products we're going to push. The highest amount of data you share, the better we can be prepared as a partner to actually execute on that. I think that's a big one. But the second thing is this really, really works when you have that mindset of collaboration. And I know collaboration is very vague, but ultimately we try always to work in a model where this is not client relationship, client vendor relationship, and so on, but really as a one team. And say, well, we're going to tackle this because ultimately the consumers that do not get their products on time, they are not looking at, who is operating the warehouse or who is doing the last mile delivery and so on. And if you go into a client, particularly in e-commerce, and you tell them, hey, we are 99% on time, that's great. They're going to tell you, well, that's not that great because, let's assume a client that does 100,000 orders per day. That means that every single day there's 1,000 clients that do not get their stuff on time. So, if you look at it that way, it's definitely not good and not good enough. And so working along these lines of how do you reach that, that awareness, the fact that in e-commerce you're touching final clients, and depending on the type of categories you ship, there are some that are more critical, right? I mean, there's a lot of gifts for kids and so on towards that period of the year, obviously. And so, many of us are parents and you know what it means, right? Delays around that and so on could have, for people, it could be more impactful also than just buying, diapers, right? That's an example.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're seeing some of that, you saw some of that in prior holiday seasons in terms of, during the pandemic. Obviously, people, it definitely got a lot of media attention in regards to gifts not arriving on time. But, I think of it now in terms of recently with baby formula as well and how scarce it's become. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's it's interesting. For the most of us, we think 99% sounds pretty darn good. But when you put it into context, that if you're one of those 1,000 or so orders that didn't get delivered on time, that's not really much consolation to say, well, but they got the other 99% right.
Definitely, and nobody will take that into consideration.
No.
So that's definitely not even the logistic head of that company will not be able to say, well, we still did 99% on time. It will not make the cut.
The bar is quite high for sure. For sure.
I'll write this one down to ask candidates in supply chain when they said, "Oh yeah, I increased the accuracy to 99%." Then I'll ask them, "And what about the rest? How did you defend that?" Yeah. So that's a good question to ask, I think. And what we're talking about is obviously so we're focusing on supply chain, but it's obviously very cross-functional work. We're talking about forecasting, commercial, a lot of different functions. How can companies organize themselves? And maybe, Ephraim, you can elaborate a bit more about that, because I know that we talked before about people, process, product. Maybe you can help me with this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's oftentimes, and I think I've seen some of this in prior companies, but I think, there's a lot of, well, I wasn't alone, I guess, in regards to thinking about it this way, in terms of when you're tackling a problem around, for example, operational efficiency, or whether it be around any sort of business challenge. A lot of times you tend to structure around, what do I need to do from a people perspective? What do I need to do in terms of the processes that I put into place? And then ultimately, what do I do around the product that I'm ultimately trying to get people to buy, right? So I would think that in that context, what do you see in terms of like, and I think you've touched on some of these already in regards to, for example, like flexibility around hiring and talking around some of what you can do around really stretching yourself, through adjustments to the process as well. But are there other things that you've seen in regards to like, how do you avoid, or how do you break through some of the silos internally? In either, from what you see at DHL, but also in terms of what you see in working with some of your clients as well?
Yeah, so I have the chance to work with primarily Fortune 500, and it's fascinating to see how companies also are trying to evolve. And it's really easy to try to compare a very large organization to a startup, where you say, well, this is the way a startup or scale-ups operate, and how do you break silos and so on. But what you found is even startups or scale-ups, when they grow, they also have their own challenge, because at the end, it is also about people. It's about ego. It's about control. It's about power. It's about money. I mean, it's about the whole human dimension of organization. It is not that straightforward. It's about diversity. It's about so it is not just like saying, well, these companies have a better culture, or these companies have a better system or better technology, or they are younger companies and consequently they work better, and so on. And you see it across many of the stories also of younger organizations that have actually a lot of challenge when they scale around culture and how do they manage their organization in the right way. I think one of the big challenges when people think about organizations based on their products and their solutions, it is really, really hard to put back the customer at the center. And the reality is that most of the organizations are built based on solutions, because it makes sense to a very large extent. But today, because we see so much convergence across the different areas of the business that is all now really interconnected, it makes it also very difficult to work that way efficiently. The best example is actually the story of online and offline departments in retailers. I mean, for how long even Walmart had maintained, different groups. But Walmart is not an exception, right? It's a lot of companies had built initially an e-commerce team or an e-commerce department in order to promote and to drive that channel, across the organization, putting people that are specialized. And it made sense at the beginning, but now it doesn't make sense anymore. Now it definitely doesn't make sense, because now the customer experience is really unified, or at least you want it to be unified, and people are looking for interaction that goes beyond the sales channel, and they want to have that experience connected. I buy something online, I return it into a store, I buy it into the store, I want to return it online. That's the most simple example. But policies, the way you treat the customer, the interfaces, the way you organize your team, and so on, is a very critical example. Another huge example that we see across organization is the innovation department. Well, innovation departments also are usually like big failures, because innovation is not a department. It's a mindset. It's a way of operating. It's a DNA. I mean, whatever you want to describe it, but it is not that there's one team that is defining how the company should be improving processes. And innovation is not only about product, it's about finance, it's about HR, it's about all the areas of the business also. And so you find these realities that made sense at the beginning, but they probably don't make any more sense now for different reasons. And then you have to make them evolve, and you have to dissolve this team and really push this into the business in order to be able to actually integrate it into one objective, which the easiest for me, my best argument is always to go back to the customer, right? Because when you go back to the customer, focus, you can actually stop a lot of the nonsense of discussion, right? And if you say, well, we are not in agreement, okay, that's fine. But what is the best for the customer? And then if you can agree on that, then usually you can work backwards and then say, okay, so this department makes no sense. This way of working makes no sense. And we then start to have a discussion that could be actually much more valuable than trying to look at departments and org structure in order to define the right path.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about retailers having like online and store separate, not being customer centric ultimately. It's interesting because I think it was Macy's that a few months ago, an activist investor was asking them to spin off online, which I think everybody found quite surprising. I believe it didn't end up happening, but I felt it was quite a strange move at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a polemical comment, but investors are good at investing. Probably they are not necessarily retail experts either, right? So sometimes we give a bit more too much credit to people that make comments or suggestions. You might want to ask someone that is a leading company what they think about that. And I think that they will probably tell you it probably makes no sense to do that. And I will not position myself as a retail expert. There are many people there that have a lot more experience than me in that space. But I would guess that if you go and ask them, would that investor recommendation make sense? Probably most of them will tell you, I'm not so sure. I'm not talking specifically about the Macy's example, right? There was maybe a financial underlying reason why he made that comment and so on. I have the detail of that, but just generally speaking, today, if you look at the broader market, e-commerce is the main driver of growth. So to me, that's fundamentally a big topic. But the second fundamental big topic is if you look today and you start to talk about generational shift and where the consumers of tomorrow are, right now, if you look at the latest statistics, Gen Z are looking for new products primarily on social media. And 40% of new product search are actually done on TikTok right now in the US. 40%. And so if you say, well, spin off the online channel, just focus on brick and mortar, I'd be very curious to know what is your strategy towards this 40% that's going to become the consumers of tomorrow that are going to be in the workforce. And what is your strategy then for the even younger generation, which probably will come even more digitalized and will be searching products, experiences, and so on, even more through social media and social channel and online channels. I would be very curious to know what the answer would be from that person.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I think you in essence answered almost like what's your, in essence, like your guiding principle around this, which is like, ask yourself if you put the customer at the center in regards to making that kind of decision, whether it happens to be about spinning off the online business or whether it be around other organizational or business decisions that you choose to make. It's interesting that, the example you gave around Gen Z and, like you said, 40% of search is happening through TikTok. Now, you could say, well, okay, but I obviously need to look at other generations. I also need to look at how that order ultimately is fulfilled. It is fulfilled in a physical store, is it fulfilled online? So, I think you kind of have to ask yourself all those questions in regards, again, with the guiding principle around like putting the customer in the center and saying, who's the customer you're talking to, right? Because obviously that answer is going to vary based on the generation that you're referring to.
Absolutely.
To that point, obviously, like you said, we've learned a lot, particularly in these last 2 to 3 years, under the circumstances that we've been in with the pandemic. But then now, I guess, it's some of the economic concerns coming up. Have there been some key learnings that you all have identified in the past in terms of like, almost like things for companies to avoid as they go into another peak season?
Yeah, what are the big screw ups that are famous in the industry in terms of preparing for peak season?
So, look, I think organizations this year are going to be better prepared than ever. Why? Because in the last 2 years, it has been, we had peak from May 2020 up to basically, March 2021. Which was really unique, right? I mean, the amount of volume you would see going through the networks and so on. So I think people got better at it and got better at managing like very, very tough market situation, from capacity constraint to increase of rates to complexity to find labor and so on. It has been literally like 2 years of training, intense training for any company in the space. Now, when we think about like what were some of the mistakes that were made, I think some of the mistakes that were made is the supply chain is always 6 months of phasing. Let's call it this way. You always have a delay between a situation that you're reading in the media and what is really happening in the real world. That's one of the reasons why we saw inflation. For example, inflation has different causes, right? But one of them is for sure the fact that shipping rates have increased significantly, and they went like 7x and 10x in certain routes and so on. So that was definitely a contributor to inflation. But you didn't see it in 2020. Why? Because shipping contracts, the large shippers, the IKEAs of the world and so on, they have 1-year contract. And so, yes, there's a couple of elements that you can get like price adjustment and so on, but the large shippers, they were protected to a certain extent in terms of like rate increases into their business. And so all this impact get phased through time, and you start to see it, like 6 months after or 8 months after. And the same happened with manufacturing. The same happened with the delays that we saw around chips and so on, because you shut down all the factories in Asia. Well, they've already been producing and they've already been putting on the water, the products that were shipped up to that day of the closeout. So you're not going to feel it immediately. There is always a phasing. And I think what I found was surprisingly badly managed was that situation by some companies that made excess of inventory in regards to what were the projections. And, I was reading some of the things. I was like, it's crazy, right? I mean, we know a lot of the boost that we saw in demand for the last 2 years. And we can argue to what extent and so on, but we know that this was primarily driven by two things. One is government incentives across businesses, across individuals, and so on, in all the mature economies and in many of the developing markets as well. And two, we had a situation where aside of the incentives, you had people that could not do anything else than stay at home and could not travel and were very limited in their outdoor activities and so on, which boosted a huge demand for, on top of the fact that we all made home offices and so on. And so this is definitely something that everybody knew. And we knew at some point the incentives will stop and we knew people will be able to go out and so on. And when you look at, for example, the excess of inventory you hear a lot across multiple brands and companies, you're really wondering, I mean, some of them did not take this into consideration, or they still felt that the demand was so strong and the economy was so strong that they would still be able to sell to the same extent. Another number that I was very surprised, people were like, oh, e-commerce is slowing down. I mean, who can think that we will maintain the same percentages of growth than last year and the year before? I mean, so the numbers, you look at Q1, Q2, you look at Shopify numbers, Amazon numbers, and so on, they're not that bad. They are 15, 16, 20% growth year on year. It's pretty good, actually. And what we see there is we just went back to the pre-COVID pace of growth, but the base is much higher because the base got really a big boost in the last 2 years. So it is not that bad in terms of growth. And so when you see this, I think the biggest thing that surprised me to some extent is there are some planning and some demand planning and delay that the people that are in the industry kind of know, but we didn't see really that necessarily be applied, very diligently by companies that are usually doing a really good job at that. So that was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, I would say that the demise of physical retail was probably a bit exaggerated, to put it lightly. And I think there were several companies, like you said, who maybe turned a blind eye to, assuming that some of the growth rates that we saw during the pandemic would continue. So it's not surprising to hear you share some of that feedback from your perspective as well.
but also like thinking that the demand for certain products would kind of be on the rise forever, no? I think. And is it possible that we've been changed from a paradigm of having an issue of out of stocks to having an issue of excess inventories? I mean, how do you see that? Because I know that there's been a lot of conversation about the two topics.
I mean, you have both, right? I mean, the truth is you have both. You have manufacturing categories that have been closed for an extended period of time, and it will take time for them to clear the backlogs. There are certain chips. Chips are probably one of the very good examples of that. You don't recover, like 12 months of backlogs in factories in Vietnam or in certain areas of China and so on, where the COVID policies were very strict. And so that some of its categories will take time to recover, probably another 12 months, to really like be back to a stable, demand supply situation. But you do have other categories that are already back to normal and that are not suffering of that situation. I think the topic of excess of inventory versus the demand, I think the big companies, which are the ones that are primarily suffering right now about that, they're going to clear this up in the peak. And I think this year is also a year of transition. There were some, it's always very easy to criticize after, but I think companies will clear up this year. And I think this will be part of history. And next year we will be in a situation where everybody will the peak season. That's why I also expect that the peak will be stronger, because that's going to be the right moment to clear up all this inventory and to have a clean book for a good start in 2023.
This has been great, Nabil. Like I said, as we were preparing for this discussion, I always learn so much from all the experts, and present company obviously not excluded from that. Thank you again. I know, like I said, our audience hopefully has found it just as insightful as Daniel and I have. I did want to ask you one last question, and actually I want to make it a two-parter. One is the question that we ask all our guests, but given that you shared your expertise with us on the peak season coming up, I wanted to ask you, is there a particular product that you're looking forward to buying during this peak season? Is there something that's on your shopping list that you're thinking about in the next coming months?
I think it's probably going to be gifts for my kids. I think that's going to be. It's interesting because I'm an e-commerce. I have a huge passion for e-commerce, but I'm not an impulsive buyer at all. So it's probably going to be for my kids. I think my next big purchase online will be a car. And I'm not sure it's going to be in the peak or maybe in Q1, but yes, it's going to be around the timeline.
That's a pretty big one. So yeah, I'll look forward to hearing from you when you share your experience on that purchase. So then the other question that I wanted to ask, and this is again a question that we ask all our guests, is that given the breadth of experience you've had over your career, what is the one piece of advice you would give to your younger self at the start of your career, looking back on everything you've learned over that time?
Yeah, I think the biggest impact for me as a professional and even as a person was to expose myself to environments and to areas of business and of life which are very fast-paced and that are evolving constantly. And so how do you translate this as an advice is, if you're going to be looking at, where should I be working? Go and work for a hyper-growth company. In which department of a company should I be working into? Go and work for the area that is pushing, building the next generation, and depending on the companies, it could be in technology, it could be in product, it could be in marketing, it could be in different areas. But if you're going to go and work for a company, go and work in the areas that are building the future of that company or that are challenging status quo. Because oftentimes also people think about large organizations as areas where there is not so much innovation, but this is actually completely factually not true. There's a lot of innovation that happens also in large organizations, but you have to work in the right areas of the business in order to be able to drive that and to build actually meaningful solutions and products that could impact the millions of lives out there. So I think the most important, in my view, and the advice I'll give is go in the areas of the business that are moving fast, that are changing, and that are building the future, because you're going to learn a lot more. You're going to evolve a lot more, and the opportunities you're going to be given are going to be endless. And I think that's probably what we all want to have as professionals, or part of it.
This was Nabil Malouli from DHL. Ephraim, what an interesting conversation. I hope that our listeners are going to be better prepared now and equipped for peak season.
Well, I know I certainly will. And I think, like a lot of our conversations, we learn lots from our friends of the show.
That's why we have them. It's it's selfish. We have them because we want to learn.
Absolutely. And I definitely will be curious to follow up with Nabil to learn how his car purchase online.
Yeah, exactly.
So, for sure. But beyond that, there was lots to unfold in regards to and to digest in this episode. I really liked Nabil's analogy to preparing for peak season is like training for a boxing fight, and how the things that you have to do well in advance of actually getting into peak season, in terms of preparing your workforce, simulating conditions during peak season, in terms of batching orders so that you can simulate those volumes and testing your capabilities before you actually get into the thick of things. Flexible hiring. I think all those things are just really nuggets of wisdom for a lot of our friends at brands and retailers to really take in and think about how they can incorporate it into their current practices.
Yeah, I thought it was also interesting the fact that he said that they were already in peak season for a whole 2 years due to lockdown. So that taught them a lot and made companies better prepared. No.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think I think most people would say that nobody would have predicted what we went through these past 2 years, but seeing it as a learning opportunity, in terms of like in essence like a 2-year peak season period is a good way to look at it in terms of from a supply chain and logistics standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. What other things that do you feel added value in terms of what you learned personally?
I think back to our discussion with Nabil and the fact that he said that in the supply chain and logistics space, being 99% right or being 99% on time isn't good enough, right? Because if you do the math, that ultimately equates to, on a very conservative basis, at least 1,000 orders for most retailers that weren't delivered on time. And if you're one of those individuals that didn't get your kid's birthday present on time, or a holiday gift on time,
or your toilet paper,
or your toilet paper, right, during COVID, or your baby formula earlier this year, that's little consolation, right? So the bar is really, really high for our colleagues in supply chain and logistics in regards to really, really striving to hit as close to 100% as they can.
Yeah, no, totally. Another big learning for me was actually the fact that, there's been a lot of conversation about excess inventories, especially in the US, and that would be cleared, according to Nabil, via promotions in this end of year. I thought that won't be as an issue on the table anymore. I thought that was quite interesting and quite revealing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that 2022 in a lot of ways is a year of transition for brands and retailers, in terms of, in essence, having to deal both with excess inventory, but also, potentially out of stocks as well, just goes to show what a real challenge it's been, and all the more reason to do the things that Nabil mentioned in terms of preparing for peak season.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Ephraim, for your conclusions as always. And thanks, of course, to our listeners for listening to us another time. Hope you enjoyed this episode. A reminder as well to follow us on LinkedIn. That's the best way to support us. We really enjoy, as you know, doing this content. But your
thank you to everybody who's already following us as well. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate all the comments. Keep them coming.
Yeah, exactly. And as always, if you want to share any feedback, recommend a guest, if you want to be a guest yourself, we're very open to all that. Also, a shout out to our sister podcast, the CPG guys in the US, and all the associated acts to it. And we'll see you in the next episode. Have a good day.